Continuing Antony, or should we say Antony, from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. And this freedom of speech was indeed the cause of many of his disasters. He never imagined those who use so much liberty in their mirth would flatter or deceive him in business of consequence, not knowing how common it is with parasites to mix their flattery with boldness, as confectioners do their sweetmeats with something biting to prevent the sense of satiety. Their freedoms and impertinences at table were designed expressly to give to their obsequiousness in counsel the air of being not complacence but conviction. Such being his temper, the last and crowning mischief that could befall him came in the love of Cleopatra to awaken and kindle fury, passion that as yet lay still and dormant in his nature, and to stifle and finally corrupt any elements that yet made resistance in him of goodness and of sound judgment. He fell into the snare thus. When making preparation for the Parthian war, he sent to command her to make her personal appearance in Cilicia, to answer an accusation that she had given great assistance in the late wars to Cassius. Dellius, who was sent on this message, had no sooner seen her face and remarked her adroitness and subtlety in speech, but he felt convinced that Antony would not so much as think of giving any molestation to a woman like this. Well, in both senses, but basically this mean bothering people. On the contrary, she would be the first in favor with him. So he set himself at once to pay his court to the Egyptian, and gave her his advice to go in the Homeric style to Cilicia in her best attire, and bade her fear nothing from Antony, the gentlest and kindest of soldiers. He had some faith in the words of Dellius, but more in her own attractions, which, having formerly recommended her to Caesar and the young Cnaeus Pompey, she did not doubt might prove yet more successful with Antony. Their acquaintance was with her when a girl, young and ignorant of the world, but she was to meet Antony in the time of life when woman's beauty is most splendid, and their intellects are in full maturity. So sometime before 25, I guess. Of course, people don't choose to be mature as a 12-year-old till they're after 30 nowadays, but she made great preparation for her journey of money, gifts, and ornaments of value, such as so wealthy a kingdom might afford, but she brought with her her surest hopes in her own magic arts and charms. She received several letters both from Antony and from his friends to summon her, but she took no account of these orders, and at last, as if in mockery of them, she came sailing up the river Cutnus in a barge with a gilded stern and outspread sails of purple, while oars of silver beat time to the music of flutes and fifes and harps. She herself lay all along under a canopy of cloth of gold, dressed as Venus in a pitcher, and beautiful young boys, like painted cupids, stood on each side to fan her. Her maids were dressed like sea nymphs and graces, some steering at the rudder, some working at the ropes. The perfumes diffused themselves from the vessel to the shore, which was covered with multitudes, part following the galley up the river on either bank, part running out of the city to see the sight. The marketplace was quite emptied, and Antony was at last left alone, sitting upon the tribunal, while the world went through all the multitude that Venus was come to feast with Bacchus for the common good of Asia. On her arrival, Antony sent to invite her to supper. She thought it fitter he should come to her. So willing to show his good humor and courtesy, he complied and went. He found the preparations to receive him magnificent beyond expression, but nothing so admirable as the great number of lights, for, on a sudden, there was let down altogether so great a number of branches with lights in them, so ingeniously disposed, some in squares and some in circles, that the whole thing was a spectacle that has seldom been equaled for beauty. Now, we don't have to, per se, waste by extravagance or whatever, but it's important that somehow we remind of divinity. Our ways, that somehow they remind people of divinity. That we enact mythic themes and mythic roles. Of course, nowadays it's more subtle and we're just watching nonsense and they sneak whatever in they want, but how redeeming one thing is or another, it's, The next day, Antony invited her to supper, and was very desirous to outdo her as well in magnificence as contrivance, but he found he was altogether beaten in both, and was so well convinced of it that he was himself the first to jest and mock at his poverty of wit and his rustic awkwardness. Well, men are going to have different ways. It's not as simple as that, but, she perceiving that his raillery was broad and gross, and savored more of the soldier than the courtier, rejoined in the same taste, and fell into it at once without any sort of reluctance or reserve, for her actual beauty, it is said, was not in itself so remarkable that none could be compared with her, or that no one could see her without being struck by it, but the contact of her presence, if he lived with her, was irresistible. The attraction of her person, joining with the charm of her conversation, and the character that attended all she said or did, was something bewitching. It was a pleasure merely to bear the sound of her voice, with which, like an instrument of many strings, she could pass from one language to another, so that there were few of the barbarian nations that she answered by an interpreter. To most of them she spoke herself, as to the Ethiopians, Troglodytes, Hebrews, Arabians, Syrians, Medes, Parthians, and many others. Now, I know people say Hebrews and Troglodytes and Arabian and Syria, you know what I mean. But Ethiopian is, they mean that they had a burnt color of skin, that they were even darker than the Arabs. That's really it. Like, oh well, there's this Egypt, but you go further into the continent, and then you have, so there were different names for Africa as time goes on, and it was the Greeks who came up with that term. It's, but it's fine. You can call me Peachy or something if you want. Many others whose language she had learned, which was all the more surprising, because most of the kings, her predecessors, scarcely gave themselves the trouble to acquire the Egyptian tongue, and several of them quite abandoned the Macedonian. And, well, there's a lot of mythology and stuff, and other, and worldly ways and stuff like this that get passed on as part of the language. So it's good to preserve some of that stuff, and there's importance to some of those grouping identities that they also preserve some sort of a sense. Antony was so captivated by her, while Fulfia, his wife, maintained his quarrels. In Rome, against Caesar by actual force of arms, and Parthian troops commanded by Labienus, the king's generals, having made him commander-in-chief, were assembled in Mesopotamia and ready to enter Syria, he could yet suffer himself to be carried away by her to Alexandria, there to keep holiday, like a boy in play and diversion, squandering and fooling away in enjoyments, that most costly, as Antiphon says, of all valuables, time. They had a sort of company to which they gave a particular name, calling it that of inimitable livers. The members entertained one another daily in turn, with an extravagance of expenditure beyond measure or belief. Philotas, a physician of Ephesus, who was at that time a student of medicine in Alexandria, used to tell my grandfather, Lampiras, that having some acquaintance with one of the royal cooks, he was invited by him, being a young man, to come and see the sumptuous preparations for supper. So he was taken into the kitchen, where he admired the prodigious variety of all things, but particularly seeing 8 wild boars roasting whole. Says he, "Surely you have a great number of guests." The cook laughed at his simplicity, and told him there were not above 12 to sup, but that every dish was to be served up just roasted to a turn, and if anything was but 1 minute ill-timed, it was spoiled. And, said he, maybe Antony would sup just now, and maybe not this hour. Maybe he will call for wine, or begin with talk, and will put it off, so that he continued, "It is not one, but many suppers must be had in readiness, as it is impossible to guess at this hour." This was Philotas's story, who related besides that he afterwards came to be one of the medical attendants of Antony's eldest son by Fulfia, and used to be invited pretty often among other companions to his table. When he was not supping with his father, one day another physician had talked loudly and given great disturbance to the company, whose mouth Philotas stopped with his sophistical syllogism. In some states of fever, the patient should take cold water. Everyone who has a fever is in some state of fever. Therefore, in a fever, cold water should always be taken. The man was quite struck dumb, and Antony's son, very much pleased, laughed aloud and said, "Philotas, I make you a present of all you see there." Well, is it necessary to have the shock? Maybe less than human temperature, but pointing to a sideboard covered with plate, Philotas thanked him much, but was far enough from ever imagining that a boy of his age could dispose of things of value. Soon after, however, the plate was all brought to him, and he was desired to get his mark upon it. And when he put it away from him, and was afraid to accept the present, "What ails the man," said he, "that brought it? Do you know that he who gives you this is Antony's son?" who is free to give it, if it were all gold. But if you will be advised by me, I would counsel you to accept of the value in money from us, for there may be amongst the rest some antique or famous piece of workmanship which Antony would be sorry to part with. These anecdotes my grandfather told us. Pilatus used frequently to relate. To return to Cleopatra, Plato admits 4 sorts of flattery, but she had 1,000. Were Antony serious or disposed to mirth, she had at any moment some new delight or charm to meet his wishes. At every turn she was upon him, and let him escape her, neither by day nor by night. She played at dice with him, drank with him, hunted with him, and when he exercised in arms, she was there to see. At night she would go rambling with him, to disturb and torment people at their doors and windows, dressed like a servant woman. For Antony also went in servant's disguise, and from these expeditions he often came home very scurvily answered, and sometimes even beaten severely, though most people guessed who it was. No, King, I didn't know it was you. However, the Alexandrians in general liked it all well enough, and joined good-humoredly and kindly in his frolic and play, saying that they were much obliged to Antony for acting his tragic parts at Rome, and keeping his comedy for them. It would be trifling without end to be particular in his follies, but his fishing must not be forgotten. He went out one day to angle with Cleopatra, and being so fortunate as to catch nothing in the presence of his mistress, he gave secret orders to the fishermen to dive under water and put fishes that had been already taken upon his hooks, and these he drew so fast that the Egyptian perceived it, but feigning great admiration, she told everybody how dexterous Antony was, and invited him the next day to come and see him again. So when a number of them had come on board the fishing boats, as soon as he had let down his hook, one of her servants was beforehand with his divers, and fixed upon his hook a salted fish from Pontus. Antony, feeling his line give, drew up the prey, and when, as may be imagined, great laughter ensued. Leave, said Cleopatra, the fishing rod general to us poor sovereigns of Pharos and Canopus. Your game is cities, provinces, and kingdoms. Whilst he was thus diverting himself and engaging in this boy's play, 2 dispatches arrived, one from Rome, that his brother Lucius and his wife Fulvia, I keep feeling like I'm going to say something else, and many quarrels among themselves had joined in war against Caesar, and having lost all, and fled out of Italy, the other bringing little better news, that Labienus, at the head of the Parthians, was overrunning Asia from Euphrates and Syria as far as Lydia and Ionia. Formerly the Asian continent was, they would say, okay, the Persians on the one side and the Hindus on the other side. And so they kind of divided it that way. But then they kind of, when they incorporated Asia, Asia, they moved it, over by Turkey is that border, and a bit of North Africa, and, So scarcely, at last, rousing himself from sleep and shaking off the fumes of wine, he set out to attack the Parthians, and went as far as Phoenicia. But upon the receipt of lamentable letters from Fulvia, he turned his course with 200 ships to Italy, and in his way receiving such of his friends as fled from Italy, he was given to understand that Fulvia was the sole cause of the war, a woman of a restless spirit and very bold, and with all her hopes were that commotions in Italy would force Antony from Cleopatra. But it happened that Fulvia, as she was coming to meet her husband, fell sick by the way and died at Sicyon, so that an accommodation was the more easily made, for when he reached Italy and Caesar showed no intention of laying anything to his charge, and he on his part shifted the blame of everything on Fulvia. Those that were friends to them would not suffer that the time should be spent in looking narrowly into the plea, but made a reconciliation first, and then a partition of the empire between them, taking as their boundary the Ionian Sea, the eastern provinces falling to Antony, to Caesar the western, and Africa being left to Lepidus. And an agreement was made that everyone in their turn, as they thought fit, should make their friends consuls, when they did not choose to take the offices themselves. These terms were well approved of, but yet it was thought some closer tie would be desirable, and for this fortune offered occasion. Caesar had an elder sister, not of the whole blood, for Etia was his mother's name, hers, and Caria the sister, Octavia, he was extremely attached to, as indeed she was, it is said, quite a wonder of a woman. Her husband, Caius Marcellus, had died not long before, and Antony was now a widower by the death of Fulvia, for though he did not disavow the passion he had for Cleopatra, yet he disowned anything of marriage, reason as yet upon this point still maintaining the debate against the charms of the Egyptian. Everybody concurred in promoting this new alliance, fully expecting that with the beauty, honor, and prudence of Octavia, when her company should, as it was certain it would, have engaged his affections, all would be kept in the safe and happy course of friendship. So both parties being agreed, they went to Rome to celebrate the nuptials, the Senate dispensing with the law, by which a widow was not permitted to marry till 10 months after the death of her husband. Sextus Pompeius was in possession of Sicily, and with his ships, under the command of Menas, the pirate, and Menocrates, so infested the Italian coast that no vessels durst venture into these seas. That no vessels durst venture into those seas. Sextus had behaved with much humanity towards Antony, having received his mother when she fled with Fulvia, and it was therefore judged fit that he also should be received into the peace. They met near the promontory of Misenum by the mole of the port, Pompey having his fleet at anchor close by, and Antony and Caesar their troops drawn up all along the shore. There it was concluded that Sextus should quietly enjoy the government of Sicily and Sardinia, he conditioning to scour the seas of all pirates, and to send so much corn every year to Rome. This agreed on, they invited one another to supper, and by lot it fell to Pompey's turn to give the first entertainment, and Antony asking where it was to be, there said he, pointing to the admiral galley, a ship of 6 banks of oars. That is the only house that Pompey is heir to of his fathers. And this, he said, reflecting upon Antony, who was then in possession of his father's house, having fixed the ship on her anchors, and formed a bridgeway from the promontory to conduct on board of her, he gave them a cordial welcome. And when they began to grow warm, and jests were passing freely on Antony and Cleopatra's loves, Menas, the pirate, whispered Pompey in the ear, "Shall I," said he, "cut the cables, and make you master, not of Sicily only, and Sardinia, but of the whole Roman Empire?" Pompey, having considered a little while, returned him answer, "Menas, this might have been done without acquainting me. Now we must rest content. I do not break my word, and so having been entertained by the other 2 in their turns, he set sail for Sicily. After the treaty was completed, Antony dispatched Ventidius into Asia to check the advance of the Parthians, while he, as a compliment to Caesar, accepted the office of priest to the deceased Caesar, and in any state affair and matter of consequence, they both behaved themselves with much consideration and friendliness for each other. But it annoyed Antony that in all their amusements, on any trial of skill or fortune, Caesar should be constantly victorious. He had with him an Egyptian diviner, one of those who calculate nativities, horoscopes, who either to make his court to Cleopatra, or that by the rules of his art, he found it to be so, openly declared to him that though the fortune that attended him was bright and glorious, yet it was overshadowed by Caesar's, and advised him to keep himself as far distant as he could from that young man. "For your genius," said he, "dreads his when absent from him. Yours is proud and brave, but in his presence unmanly and dejected." The incidents that appeared to show that the Egyptian spoke truth, for whenever they cast lots for any playful purpose, or threw dice, Antony was still the loser, and repeatedly, when they fought the gamecocks or quails, Caesar had the victory. This gave Antony a secret displeasure, and made him put the more confidence in the skill of the Egyptian. So, leaving the management of his home affairs to Caesar, he left Italy and took Octavia, who had lately borne him a daughter, along with him into Greece. Here, whilst he wintered in Athens, he received the first news of Ventidius's successes over the Parthians, of his having defeated them in a battle, having slain Lapienus and Pharnapetus, the best general their king Herodotus possessed, for the celebrating of which he made public feast through Greece. Over the prizes which were contested at Athens, he himself acted as steward, and leaving at home the ensigns that are carried before the general, he made his public appearance in a gown and white shoes, with a steward's wands marching before, and he performed his duty in taking the combatants by the neck to part them when they had fought enough. Now, what would be the meaning of the white shoes? When the time came for him to set out for the war, he took a garland from the sacred olive, and in obedience to some oracle, he filled a vessel with the water of the clepsydra to carry along with him. In this interval, Pacorus, the Parthian king's son, was marching into Syria with a large army, was met by Ventidius, who gave him battle in the country of Corestica slew a large number of his men, and Pacorus among the first. This victory was one of the most renowned achievements of the Romans, and fully avenged their defeats under Crassus, the Parthians being obliged, after the loss of 3 battles successively, to keep themselves within the bounds of Media and Mesopotamia. Ventidius was not willing to push his good fortune further, for fear of raising some jealousy in Antony, but turning his arms against those that had quitted the Roman interest, he reduced them to their former obedience. Among the rest, he besieged Antiochus, king of Commagena, in the city of Samosata, who made an offer of 1,000 talents for his pardon, and a promise of submission to Antony's commands. But Ventidius told him that he must send to Antony, who was already on his march, and had sent word to Ventidius to make no terms with Antiochus, wishing that at any rate this one exploit might be ascribed to him, and that people might not think that all his successes were won by his lieutenants. The siege, however, was long protracted, for when those within found their offers refused, they defended themselves stoutly till at last Antony, finding he was doing nothing in shame and regard for having refused the first offer, was glad to make an accommodation with Antiochus for 300 talents, and having given some orders for the affairs of Syria, he returned to Athens, and paying Ventidius the honors he well deserved, dismissed him to receive his triumph. He is the only man that has ever yet triumphed for victories obtained over the Parthians. He was of obscure birth, but by means of Antony's friendship obtained an opportunity of showing his capacity and doing great things, and his making such glorious use of it gave new credit to the current observation about Caesar and Antony, that they were more fortunate in what they did by their lieutenants than in their own persons, for Sausius also had great success, and Canidius, whom he had left in Armenia, defeated the people there, and also the kings of the Albanians and Iberians, and marched victorious as far as Caucasus, by which means the fame of Antony's arms had become great amongst the barbarous nations. He, however, once more upon some unfavorable stories, taking offense against Caesar, set sail with 300 ships for Italy, and being refused admittance to the port of Brundusium, made for Tarentum. There his wife Octavia, who came from Greece with him, obtained leave to visit her brother, she being then great with child, having already borne her husband a second daughter. And as she was on her way, she met Caesar with his 2 friends, Agrippa and Maecenas, and taking these 2 aside, with great entreaties and lamentations, she told them that of the most fortunate women upon earth, she was in danger of becoming the most unhappy, for as yet everyone's eyes were fixed upon her as the wife and sister of the 2 great commanders. But if rash counsels should prevail and war ensue, I shall be miserable, said she, without redress, for on what side soever victory falls, I shall be sure to be a loser. Caesar was overcome by these entreaties, and advanced in a peaceable temper to Tarentum, where those who were present beheld a most stately spectacle, a vast army drawn up by the shore, and as great a fleet in the harbor, all without the occurrence of any act of hostility. Nothing but the salutations of friends and other expressions of joy and kindness passing from one armament to the other, Antony first entertained Casar, this also being a concession on Casar's part to his sister, and when at length an agreement was made between them that Casar should give Antony 2 of his legions to serve him in the Parthian war, and that Antony should return leave with him 100 armed galleys. Octavia further obtained of her husband, besides this, 20 light ships for her brother, and of her brother 1,000 foot for her husband. So, having parted good friends, Casar went immediately to make war with Pompey to conquer Sicily, and Antony, leaving in Casar's charge his wife and children, and his children by his former wife Fulvia, set sail for Asia. And of course, one of the things we probably should look at is remembering the fact that I'm trying to say these things in a Latin or Greek way rather than an Italian way. And yes, I know churches and people like that tend to say Latin in an Italian way, but that's not how it is.